But I thought I'd provoke you by telling you that in the last year, fortunately, I get some invitations to speak to political organizations and interesting groups of people. Only one organization which invited me to speak over the last year started on time and ended on time. That organization was the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Okay. So, on the one hand, I suppose you could take the view that there's no necessary relationship between punctuality and popular support. On the other hand, you could take the view that the PAC has given everybody else something to aspire to. But nevertheless, university meetings don't start on time either. I've been asked to talk mainly about higher education and where I think we are on higher education. But before I do that, I want to put things in context. It's always useful to put things in context. And I think that what we are experiencing in higher education at the moment is simply an aspect of what we are experiencing as a society, as a country. And I also think, and this will hopefully be of interest to members of the Young Communist League, I think that a lot of the issues which we are dealing with today are discussed in a book I was fortunate enough to publish this year, which is, incidentally, I hope you're aware, I suspect that there are some people in this room who haven't read my book, and the reason I suspect that is that scientific studies show that the reason we have a drought at the moment is that not enough people have read my book. So, read the book, the more it will rain and the happier we'll all be. Okay. That's right, yes, absolutely. So, the book is actually about a former member of the Communist Party called Harold Wolpe, who passed away in about 1995. And I'll be saying quite a bit more about Harold Wolpe later on, because for those of you who are not familiar with him, when he returned from exile, he returned to take over the economic policy unit at the University of the Western Cape, and he was also on the ANC education task team during the negotiations of that time. In fact, those who know him believe that he had literally worked himself to death working on ANC policy proposals in 1995. And the reason I mentioned Harold Wolpe is not only to push my book, but because I think that what Harold Wolpe had to say about education and about higher education in particular is still very relevant today. And it's relevant today because some of what Harold Wolpe had to say about the society as a whole is very relevant today. Now, where are we as a society today? I think that there's an academic answer and there's a real human being answer. And the real human being answer goes something like this. Incidentally, if you are academic, any of you are interested in it, a lot of this is written up by myself and various colleagues in various places, and we're developing an idea called path dependence, and what you're going to be hearing about is path dependence. But to normal human beings, what all this means is if we think of South Africa, as we surely should, South Africa in 1994, as a country which was run, whose economy and society was run by an exclusive club which consisted purely of white people, what has happened in the last 21 years is that new members have been admitted to the club. But the club is still an exclusive club, and the new members do not have the same membership rights as the old members. Now, what I mean by this is that I need to be not understood here, because very often when I make this argument, people say, well, you're saying nothing has changed in this society in the last 21 years. Well, that's not what I'm saying at all. Some important things have changed in this society in the last 20 years. The most notable of them being, whether one likes it or not, the creation of this very interesting group of South Africans called the black middle class, who are black people who, of course, were denied up until 1994 the right to progress in the professions, in the economy, etc. And a great deal has changed since 1994. But what has not fundamentally changed is the idea that power in the economy and the society is still wielded by the same people who wielded power in the economy and the society in 1994, except that they have admitted more people into the club. Some black people have become members of that club. The consequence, however, is that as we experienced before 1994, the majority of South Africans, working people, unemployed people, people who live in poverty, are excluded from that club. And that is why we have much of the tension which we have in this society. I mean, one of many examples which I often quote to illustrate this, one of the reasons, and it's by no means the only reason, that we have labor relations tension in this country is because the pressure on workers' salaries is created by two factors, both of which are inherited from our past. The first problem workers face is that there is intense pressure in this society, if you want to be regarded by your fellow South Africans as a decent human being, to own various goods. South Africans are not judged on their character and their intellectual abilities. South Africans are usually judged by how much stuff they own. And if you are a working person or a poor person and you can't afford the stuff you're supposed to own, well then you borrow to pay for the stuff that you're supposed to own. But unfortunately you can't pay back everything that you have to borrow, and either you have this wonderful South African invention called the garnishee order, which is an order that a company gets to make sure that the money is deducted from your salary, or you're in debt to various types of lenders who aren't really playing by the rules. The second reason why there's immense pressure on workers' wages is because it is well known, and we need more research on this, but the basics are well known, that working people in this country, and very specifically because of various historical factors, black working people in this country, are usually supporting a great many family members who are unemployed or unable to support themselves because of the state of the economy. It's estimated on the mines that each mine worker's pay feeds 8 to 10 people beyond that person's family. We're not quite sure where this figure comes from, but I think that we can be pretty sure that the figure is high. That most people who are earning a salary in this country are supporting quite a lot of other people who need that person's income in order to get by. And of course, both of these are products of our past in the sense that both poverty and inequality are very much part of what we experienced in this society up until 1994. I also said that not everybody is a member of this club on the same terms, and not everybody has the same rights. And one of the consequences of that is that, as I said earlier on, we have a lot more middle-class black people in this country who are now part of the club in the sense that they can earn an income in the professions and they can get the qualifications which are required. But very often they feel that they are, and with a great deal of justification, that they are treated as second-class members of the club. So the way I put it very often is that in the main, I'm obviously generalizing to a certain extent, in the main, particularly younger black middle-class people in this country have the qualifications and the opportunities which their parents and grandparents did not have, but they encounter much the same racial attitudes as their parents and their grandparents encountered. And this leads to a great deal of tension and a great deal of anger among middle-class people. Now, if that's where we were as a society, the reason I've been belaboring this is that that's where our higher education system is as well. I think that our higher education system is an excellent example of this path dependence that I'm talking about. What has happened in South Africa higher education over the last 21 or so years is this. If you look at education around the world, you see that up until the period after the Second World War, education just about everywhere, in fact everywhere, higher education was for the elite only. Okay? If you're a working person or you're a person living in even a middle-class person very often, don't expect to go to university, because in the main that wasn't going to happen. University was for the rich. In parts of Europe, university was for the nobility. It certainly wasn't for the rest of the society. And what happened in the period after the Second World War in Europe and began to spread to the rest of the world is because of the welfare state, which was introduced at that stage. You have something which academics who write on higher education called massification. And massification is a pretty ugly word, and I only use it because if you read about these things, that's the word that's usually used. But in effect, massification is the process which has been going on now in many countries for about 50 years, of admitting more people into the higher education system, of opening the higher education system to hopefully, or in theory, to anybody who can afford to go. Obviously, when massification started, and that's still the case, it introduced a whole lot of problems into the system. And in many cases, in other parts of the world, those problems haven't been fully dealt with. But seeing that the process has been going for 50 or 60 years, the process has been dealt with more effectively there than it is in countries which have started massification much later. Now, of course, South Africa is a classic example of a country which started massification a whole lot later. Because in effect, yes, black people were not banned from university under apartheid, but they were certainly banned from the major universities. I don't have to make the point in a gathering like this that there were huge restrictions on black South Africans during this period. And what has happened since the birth of democracy is that new people have been integrated into the system. People who were excluded from the system were integrated. And I obviously don't have to make the point that that democratizes the system. Obviously, it makes it a more defensible system, a more democratic system. But the sad reality is that the path dependence which exists in the society exists in higher education as well. And therefore, what the society has not done, and when I say the society, I mean the universities themselves, but I also mean government. And I also mean those who've had positions of responsibility in government, have not succeeded in creating a situation where people who have been admitted into the system, who were excluded in the past, have been made to feel comfortable in that system, have been made to feel at home in that system. And in the university system, the higher education system, just as in the country, you have an economic element to this, and you have a non-economic element to this. And both of those have been very much under discussion in higher education this year. The economic element, of course, is contained in the demand for freezes in fees, or the demand for free higher education, and the non-economic element is contained in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, in the demand for decolonialized education. But there's a great deal more to it, which we haven't even skimmed the surface of. One of the most moving experiences I've had recently was at an academic discussion in which we were debating what was happening at the universities. And one of my academic colleagues gave a rather odd speech in which she said, no, well, there's no real problem at the universities. You know, the only problem is that these youngsters have come into the university from private schools, and they just think that they're, you know, special, and then they come to university and discover that they're not special, which is a fairly offensive. But now, what happened in response to that is a colleague of mine who's in her late 40s, whose name would probably be known to many people in the room because she's a major intellectual figure in this country, a black person from the Eastern Cape, described when she was a student. She was fortunate enough because her parents at that stage were part of the small middle class, and her parents could send her to the University of Cape Town. And she describes that she was so terrified by the University of Cape Town, by just the overwhelming presence of what she saw as a white institution which really didn't cater for people like her, that without telling her parents, she slipped away and actually registered at the University of Western Cape. And it actually took her parents a year to discover that she was registered at UWC rather than UCT. And she did that because she said that she emotionally could not handle the prospect of actually being part of the University of Cape Town, because she simply saw it as an organization which oppressed her rather than an organization which enabled her to express herself. And I don't think that she's alone. I think that she's expressing something which I think a great many people feel. Now, I said I'd say something about Harold Wolpe, and I think it's important to say something about Harold Wolpe because as an indication, and I'm not saying that Harold Wolpe was perfect, I spend quite a lot of the book criticizing a lot of the things he had to say. But he's writing, and that of his colleagues, people like Salim Badat, who was until recently Vice-Chancellor at Rhodes, and others, their writings in the 1990s on the education system were, and I've been told to be provocative, the reality is they were ignored by the African National Congress. They have been ignored largely by government up until then, and we are paying a price for ignoring them. And there are a couple of things about what they had to say which I think we need to take very seriously at the moment. And the first thing that I want to stress which they had to say was that at that stage, there was a very interesting debate going on, which I'm sure most people have not heard of. It didn't get much publicity at the time, but it's actually crucial to what we're experiencing at the moment. And what happened with the debate was that the argument was made, the view was expressed, that what had happened under apartheid is that we had normal, natural universities, and then we had universities which were created by apartheid bureaucrats. And surprise, 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 the natural universities in this view, not Harold Wolpe's view, the opposite view, the natural universities were all the universities which upper middle class white people went to, Wits, UCT, Stellenbosch, Rhodes, etc., etc. And these were the natural universities, these were the real universities. The fake universities were the universities which were created by apartheid bureaucrats, etc., etc., UWC, University, what is now University of Limpopo, etc., etc., etc. And so the argument was that what we needed was to leave those institutions alone, to leave the Witzes and the Rhodeses alone so that they could go back to doing what they naturally needed to do, and close the other ones down because they would be created by apartheid bureaucrats. Wolpe and his colleagues made the obvious point, which is very relevant at the moment, that all universities up until 1994 were apartheid universities. There were no natural universities in the white suburbs and unnatural universities in the other parts. And because all universities were apartheid universities, all universities at the time needed to change. And the problem was, he and his colleagues said, the universities weren't prepared to change, they expected their new students to change instead. And he used a very interesting example, and I'm sure it'll mean something to some people in the room, which was an issue at that time. This was 1994, 1995. He said the universities have started to run academic support courses which teach students, in effect what he was saying is, they teach black students how to be white. Okay, well, they don't do it very well because it's not very easy to do that. And he said what actually was required was not courses to get the students to fit into what the university wanted them to be, but a very serious discussion of how to get the university to fit in what the students needed it to be. And that didn't happen at the time. It was ignored at the time. And that is part of the reality we have to experience at the moment. The second thing that he and his colleagues got involved with, very similar, very interesting debate on what was, in a sense, was called at that stage the development and equity debate. And the debate was this, it's something that would be very familiar to people. Are our universities there to promote economic growth, Or are and development, or are our universities there in order to be places of inclusion, in order to be places where learning can flourish, places of equity, places in which every South African who wants to has a place? And Walpe and his colleagues' argument was that this was a false debate, because we needed both. But what they said, which is very relevant to what needs to happen today, what they said was very important, is that the only way you could do it, because that was the way the balance of power operated, is that you really needed serious negotiation on the future of the universities. You needed negotiation which included those constituencies who were conservative. It needed to include business, it needed to include some of those professional constituencies, but essentially it needed to include working people, it needed to include students themselves. And of course, we haven't had that negotiation, just as we haven't had the kind of negotiation we ought to have as a society about how to make this a fairer and a more just place. We haven't had that discussion about the universities. So I think really what we are looking at the moment, if you look at the way forward, is that we need to start addressing the unfinished business in South African universities. But I think that when we do that, we need to be realistic and we need to be aware of trends in other parts of the world. Now, clearly when one says it ought to be negotiated, you're not saying that the negotiations will only work if they come up with proposals that make people like me happy. But I think there's some principles one needs to bear in mind here. Okay. And the principles we need to bear in mind here, and the one that will be controversial in this room and others, is that if you look around the world, I would argue very strongly that the demand for free education for all is not a particularly progressive demand, and it hasn't had particularly progressive outcomes in other societies in the world. What do I mean by that? If you look at Brazil, which some people regard as an interesting analogy, when the Workers' Party government was elected in Brazil, one of the first things they did was abolish free higher education. Why did they abolish free higher education? For the same reason that it is not necessarily a progressive demand in this country. Because what was happening in Brazil was, to put it very bluntly, free education, higher education in Brazil was a kind of free ride for the upper middle class and the rich. Because the upper middle class and the rich sent their children to university, and poor people paid for them to go to university. And that is the danger you face if the demand is free education for all. The danger you face is that those students in our universities today, whose families could quite literally, if you look at the distribution of this income in this country, there are families sending children, pupils, learners to school and students to university in this country today who could quite comfortably pay 5 times what the fees are at the moment, and it would simply mean that they would have to have one less yacht or whatever it is that they enjoy. Now, I can't understand, and I've debated this with many people, how it can be a progressive demand to say that those people should have free higher education. I don't see how anybody would benefit from that. It's argued, and some people argue, that you could use the tax system to ensure that those people pay more. That is true, but if you look at it, that's a rather involved way of doing it. 5 times removed, you charge somebody a wealth tax, and then you hope it goes to education, etc. Why is that a better system than simply saying to rich people, pay more for education? Because the progressive demand, surely, and that's what we're talking about, is that anybody in this society should be able to go to university if they qualify. Nobody in this society should be excluded from university because they can't afford it. And that, I think, is a principle worth fighting for. But I think that one of the consequences of that principle is precisely that those people in the upper middle class and those people who own large businesses who can be supporting our education system should be able to do it. As far as the question of changing our universities is concerned, this is an incredibly important issue. But I think the realism that needs to be injected into this is that it is really something which needs to be negotiated over the next few months, over perhaps part of next year. Because if you don't negotiate it, I can assure you we're going to be having all sorts of problems which we didn't have before. We had a very interesting meeting at the University of Johannesburg on Wednesday, in which all of us were invited to discuss what we think ought to be done. One of the things that came up was we urgently need transformation of the curriculum. We urgently need to make sure that what we teach, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, speaks to the experience of the majority of South Africans. But you can't simply do that, and I can assure you that if we do not negotiate it, that is exactly what will happen. We can't simply do it by leaving it up to a process in which people will carry on doing exactly the same thing as they're doing before, and they'll slap on a course in African thought, or they'll slap on a course in post-colonial philosophy, and then the entire thing will just carry on as it had before. The only way to prevent that is by a process of engagement, is by a process of negotiation, which will go on for quite some time. The other issue which some of us are placing on the agenda, which is very consistent with this idea of path dependency, is that we really need to have a serious discussion in this country, and the chair mentioned this in the introduction, about forms of higher education other than the standard university. I mean, whether it's the universities of technology, as they're now called, or the various other post-matric institutions which teach people various skills which are not taught by the academic universities. And the reason I'm concerned about this is the following. One of the path dependencies I'm talking about, one of the tendencies to continue what was done in the past, is, in my view, the most absurd debate which is occurring in South Africa today. And the most absurd debate which is occurring in South Africa today is the jobs debate, okay? The jobs debate, in which we have this argument between various interest groups and political parties about who's going to create 8 million jobs and 6 million jobs, and heaven knows, you pick the thing out of your mind, okay? Well, I can tell you one thing which I think any sober analysis of the economy shows you. You're all young people here. In your lifetime, it is highly unlikely that most South Africans will be working in a formal job. Okay? It doesn't matter whether we introduce socialism, whether we introduce raw free market capitalism, whether we introduce whatever. Just the mismatch between the formal economy and the society is too great. And if you think we're the only country in that position in the world, we're not. Increasing numbers of countries are in the position. So the first thing you have to do about this, on the level of broad policy, is you have to stop this debate about how are we all going to create a fantasy world, and we've got to start the real debate, and the real debate is how we make sure that every adult South African has a decent livelihood. And that's a totally different debate. There are colleagues of mine working in the mining industry at the moment on some very interesting ideas. They're saying they don't even talk about jobs anymore. They talk about livelihoods. They talk about the ability to earn a decent income. Because the only way, going to a formal job is not the only way you can earn a formal income. And we need to have that discussion. And that discussion doesn't get business off the hook, because if they don't contribute to that, then it's not going to happen. The relevance to this of higher education is twofold. First of all, we need tertiary technical institutions which can actually train people for that and can actually equip people for that. We need tertiary institutions which can enable those people who want to walk out of those institutions and to be able to earn a decent living, whether or not they land up in the great white South African dream of the 1950s, in which everybody gets up in the morning and goes to a shop or an office and a factory, which is an easy thing to do if you're using guns to silence 90% of the population, but isn't possible if you don't do that. That's the first part of it. The second part is that one of the things we've inherited is this very colonial pecking order, this very colonial hierarchy in which the real university and the real student is a person who goes to study higher maths or philosophy, and the sort of fake student is the person who actually goes and studies something which might actually be useful to somebody else. Plumbing, electricity, etc. I'm sort of denigrating my own job to a certain extent, but the only difference there should be between a technical tertiary institution and an academic tertiary institution is that they're teaching different things. Not better things or worse things, they're treating different things. And unless we start taking that seriously, we are going to have severe problems because we're going to have immense pressure on our universities from people who want to go to university, not because the courses offered there are their first prize or what they really want to do, but because the status messages that go out in the society tell them that if you want to be a worthwhile human being, you have to sit there being bored in a lecture theatre rather than doing something, in their case, which you might be really good at. There is no difference in principle in a democratic society between the person who can do good technical work and the person who can do good academic work, and our education system should reflect that. Obviously, these are simply broad principles. But I think those broad principles start to give us a basis on which to work. A basis in which I would hope that instead of what I think we've seen so far in the environment in a response to the protests, which is to say, let's have a commission of inquiry or a task team, what we really need is not a commission of inquiry or a task team. We really need a serious negotiation process. The organization that you belong to and very similar organizations and student organizations, etc., have to be at a negotiating table bargaining about what sort of higher education system we want and how we actually translate those ideas of fairness and equity and democracy, which we should have been talking about in 1994 but didn't talk about in 1994, into a reality in the society in which we live. I don't imagine those negotiations will be easy. No negotiations ever are. But the one point I must stress about negotiations is that when very often you get attacked when you talk about negotiations, you say, well, we don't want to negotiate with those people because they're a bunch of powerful fat cats and we don't like them very much. The answer is that's why you have to negotiate with them, okay? If they were nice folks, you wouldn't have to negotiate with them. You would just go and give them a list of what needed to be done. Precisely because they have power, they need to be negotiated with. One of the arguments that some of us have been putting on the table since the birth of the trade union movement in this country quite a long time ago is that negotiation is not it's not a love fest. Negotiation is a political process. But more importantly, negotiation is a process in which those who do not have power, if they're organized, if they're mobilized, if they have an effective power base, can actually start to exercise power. And hopefully, one of the consequences of what we've seen on our campuses over the last while or so will be the beginning, 21 years too late, but still these things are never too late, of a real negotiation process, not only about the future of our education system, but hopefully about the future of this country. Thank you. Before I do that, seeing that some people have been giving me a hard time, can I ask this meeting a message? Is it contrary to the rules of the YCL for women to participate, or is it just sort of practice? I've just been asked 14 male questions. I see various women in the room. They appear to have voices. Anyway, you deal with it. I think it's an issue. Okay. I'm going to start simply because there was clearly, I'll deal with all the other stuff. Lebo over there who's worried about aspersions. Okay, incidentally, I wasn't talking about people in the room. My suspicion is that people in this room probably will get jobs. What I'm talking about is this. The world economy, if you are a historical materialist, the question of changes in the forces of production are very important. Okay. We are experiencing a profound change in the forces of production throughout the world today, okay? And have been for the last while or so, okay? A change which may be as profound as the change which produced the Industrial Revolution, which is where Marxism comes from in the first place. And one of the consequences of that profound change is that those days we remember from, which in human history is not that great, from 20, 30, 40 years ago, the day of the mass production factory is disappearing. I just come here. Okay, all right.
This one is for the camera sound.
Yeah, it's fine. All right, sure. All right, so what I was saying about this, why did I say that millions of South Africans are not going to have jobs in your lifetime? Formal jobs. I was very clear on formal jobs. Okay. What I'm addressing at is this. We are still trapped in the paradigm of the mass production workplace, which has been the reality from the Industrial Revolution to now. That is changing. It is changing everywhere. And one of the consequences of it changing is that simply whether you fix the education system or you don't fix the education system, whether you have whatever form of socialism or capitalism you happen to have, there is a huge mismatch between what the formal economy can employ and the number of people. Now, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and that's where we talk about livelihoods, this is not a disaster for anybody. It should not be a disaster for anybody if we focus on the right issues and we talk about the right issues. Because we are not saying, those of us who argue this, that because of this reality, millions of people must be condemned to starvation and begging, etc. What we are saying is that we need to think very seriously about how we deal with that. And let me give you a concrete example, and I know it's not a popular example among a lot of people because people have all sorts of prejudices against it, but it just illustrates the point I'm trying to make. If you look in this country over the last 20 years at the effect that social grants have had on people at the bottom of the scale, it's a profound effect, okay? Now, the obvious question, now that people who get social grants are not in employment, right? So if we can make a difference to people's lives, if we can start reviving rural economies simply by putting small amounts of money in people's pockets, how much more could we do if we started giving those people the infrastructure they needed, the skills they needed, the access they needed, the transport they needed, and so on and so forth. And that's what I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about a situation in which we say, okay, well, 10% of the society will live a good life and we just worry about the rest. I simply think that we have to be realistic that model which white people remember from the 60s is gone everywhere. It's not going to be a reality, and they don't worry about it in Europe because they're very rich and they've got zero population growth. You go to Asia, you go to Latin America, and everybody's worried about it. So that's all I'm saying. What I do say, and that's the last intervention, I certainly don't think the education system is irrelevant to this at all, because we really need to have a conversation. We really need to look at how the education system can equip people for this reality a lot better than it's doing at the moment. And it's not doing it very well at all, at school level as well as at university level. Okay, let me start dealing with the many other questions. Incidentally, somebody wanted to know why I said that, you can't choose between capitalism and socialism. I don't recall saying that, so I'm not quite sure where that comes from. Sorry, where is there? I think my notes are still there. There have been various calls. We don't want negotiation. We just want to dismantle the system, etc. Okay. Well, let's just go back to the basics, okay, seeing that this is the Young Communist League, etc. If you go back to the beginnings of Marxist thought, what was Marxist thought worried about? It was worried about the way in which some people were able to exercise economic power over others, okay? Which was an issue then and is an issue today. And it was worried about how you change that. And the initial idea in the original Marxist texts was that you changed that through a revolution. And the revolution was a process in which the old relationships got swept away and a new set of relationships got introduced. Okay. Now, it may be difficult, and people will create this example and that example, etc. There are very few cases. I mean, if you're interested in this stuff, I've written a long theoretical article on this a couple of years back. There are very few cases in human history where anything like that has ever happened. Okay? There are two things which I think we need to think about. Well, that's the way I approach it, etc. Every time power shifts from those who have economic power to those who don't have economic power, you have a change. It is simply not true to say that it is impossible for that to happen in this system, because there are millions of South Africans who are living evidence to the fact. I mean, some of us are ancient and we remember what working people used to be paid in this society. And the fact that working people are not paid that in this society anymore has nothing to do with anybody's goodwill. It has to do with power. It has to do with the fact that working people form trade unions and they exercise power and they change those power relationships. And when we were forming trade unions back in that period, there were people who said, don't worry about trade unions, you have to just overthrow the system and then we'll live happily ever after. And I think that if you look back at the last 40 years, I think most people would agree that working people are better off now because we had those trade unions, not because it's some little lollipop which is given to people while they suffer, because the trade union movement didn't only change who got what, the trade union movement also changed who exercised power. And the model in which I operate is one in which what you are concerned about is changes in shift of power. And some of those changes of shift in power happen because the political system changes, and some of them happen without the political system changing. And in a sense, the person at the back who said, we haven't had those changes in the society is absolutely right. But why haven't we had those changes in the society? It's not because people negotiated in 1994. It's because people stopped negotiating in 1994 that we have the problem we have at the moment. Because what was achieved in 1994 was a shift in political power. What was not achieved in 1994, and we're living with the consequences of it today, was a shift in social and economic power. Now, if it is possible to negotiate a shift in economic power, I think it is possible to negotiate a shift, in political power, in social and economic power as well. And that is the position that I take. I think that far too often we live in, if people, have read Marxist texts, etc., I think there's far too often a tendency to wait for the great revolutionary day in which everything will be swept away and you can start again. And it hardly ever happens. Very often, when it seems to happen, what you land up with is the same people doing this. Is different people doing the same things as before. So I think we really need to have a serious discussion on how you change things in society for those who are concerned about inequality, etc. Let me deal with this question of free education, which has come up from a great many people. First of all, I think there was somebody over there who said, no, we're not talking about those who earn millions, etc. Well, if you're not talking about those who earn millions, then we're talking the same language. There's not anything really to discuss. The issue is, if you take the view that we need free education for everyone, how are you going to deal with the problem that many of the people who will get that free education are people who could comfortably afford to pay for education and who are getting a freebie? And they're not getting a freebie from other middle-class people. They are getting a freebie from poor people and from working people. So, for example, the person over there says, is free education possible? Of course free education is possible. But you always have to ask questions if you're worried, as I presume socialists are, about how goods are distributed in society. When you talk about a change, you have to say who's benefiting and who's paying. And if the consequence is that the poor are paying for the rich, well, then that's clearly not something we want. So you need to have, look, I'm not talking, if somebody can show me that there's a way of doing this through the tax system, which doesn't mean that you take much needed resources away from poor and working people. I'll go with it. I just haven't seen it because it doesn't seem to operate there. The experience around, people are saying, well, in our context, free education would work. Free education, in that sense, free higher education, is not particularly progressive in societies with high levels of inequality. And we have a high level of inequality. If we can somehow get the inequality to go away, that's a different story. So the question I'm throwing back at everybody who has that position is to say, well, what are you going to do about giving a freebie for the rich? And I think that we need to confront that problem. Incidentally, the person who asked me, how do we measure the ability to pay, etc., is asking an excellent question, and it's a question which deserves a serious answer. I am not talking about some kind of crude pension-type system in which you say everybody above this level has to pay and everybody below level has to pay. Surely we do need to look at people's circumstances, but that's precisely what I'm arguing for, is a system where you don't lump the person who's got 8 dependents together with the person who's got no dependents. It's come up in the context of student loans in a very interesting way. The standard middle-class answer to this problem is let's have student loans. Well, for some people, student loans are affordable. For other people, because of their social and economic status, student loans are a burden, are another fetter which reduces people to poverty. We surely have the resources in this country to distinguish between those who need and those who don't. And if you ask me for a recipe on how to do it, I'm not going to give you a recipe on how to do it, because my position is that it needs to be negotiated, and I can't impose what the outcome should be. I think those people, we're getting back to the negotiation question. There are people saying, no, we don't want to negotiate anymore. We simply want the transformation. Well, I'm throwing it back at you. If that's your position, how are you going to do it? I don't have a problem with that in principle. I just want to know how you do it. The reason for negotiation is, the point that I'm making is, the power that the minority have doesn't go away. Okay? Well, you can either close your eyes and pretend it isn't there, or you can pretend you've abolished it, or say, what is our strategy? If you ask me, the finger I would point at government over the last 20 years in this country, it is not the usual nonsense you hear about how they've done this wrong, etc. I would say, what has your strategy been to deal with inherited power? What has your strategy been to deal with the power of people who were dominating under apartheid? Because I think what has been done is very little has been done. I don't see a strategy to say how we're going to change that. So we need more than slogans on this. A couple of things. What does an African curriculum look like? Look, I don't think that, certainly we have to have some discussions, but quite frankly, as somebody who works in political science and social science, etc., the difference between what, a vaguely defensible curriculum and what we have at the moment is so great that, you don't have to look around for massive changes. I will just give you one example. I become very agitated about this. Okay, when I wrote my book on Harold Wolpe, okay, he happens to be a white guy, but still, I think it was the first mainstream book in a while that's quoted Samuel Chumbu, that's quoted Bernard Makubani, that's quoted Archie Mafeje. I mean, these are major South African thinkers, for heaven's sake, who are totally relegated to the margins, and we know why they're relegated to the margins. So we need to start, I think looking around the universities today, because I'm in the field, I don't teach undergrads, etc. I know of 2 universities in this country which are offering serious graduate level and postgraduate degrees in African thought. I know 3 or 4 who are teaching African philosophers and African political scientists. And none of this is rocket science. If you go to the average European university, there are 33 degrees in European history and 43 degrees in European philosophy, etc., etc. And they learn about their environment. What I was talking about when I talked about transformation of the curriculum, let us not land up in a situation where we have the same thing we've been having for the last who heaven knows how many years, with some guy in a corner teaching a 2-year course on African philosophy to make everybody feel better. I don't think it takes rocket scientists to work out that we should be teaching the history of our continent, seen through the thinkers of our continent, and of course you don't ignore the rest, but you integrate them into a course. So instead of the usual dead white male thing as the mainstream, you can drag in the dead white males to illustrate what the African thinkers are saying. And I think we really need to go in that direction very quickly. I'm just trying to, I think I've probably dealt with, I'm trying to think if there's stuff that I haven't dealt with. Oh yes, sorry. Look, I think I've got 2 points to make about that. I think the first one is, yes, I agree with you absolutely that this would be, there is an opportunity here to do something. The only thing, and you can create a role model, and that would be very useful, but I'm sure we'd agree on that. You don't want a situation where it leaves the others off the hook, okay? So you want a situation where those universities are doing that. You see, the problem we have is that, this is a very urban-based society, and whatever you do, whatever you do with those universities, you still have this idea that the real education is happening at WITS, UCT, etc. So that does reduce our room to maneuver on this. But still, I mean, your point, if you start 2 greenfield universities, should they be about the future rather than the past? Absolutely. Right. And look, sorry for those who are talking about, the models of the white male professor. I mean, we agree on that. There's no debate about that. I mean, many of us are on record for ages saying, it's absolutely scandalous what the composition of faculty. I mean, we all know stories like that, etc. I am at the moment trying to assist a black colleague at UCT to get a professorship by supporting his application, etc. I mean, in any university in the world, this guy would have been a full professor 10 years ago. I don't even know why we're having the conversation. And it's been a year since we submitted the application, and UCT is still sitting on it. And he's not the only one. So, yes, it is called. How did you know? Well, you guessed, yeah, okay. I don't think he'd mind me mentioning it. I mean, what if you know who it is? I mean, he knows who I'm talking about. I mean, for heaven's sake, the guy has, a doctorate from Cornell, 14 fellowships to Harvard, etc. What on earth are we talking about here? And he's sitting as a deputy associate professor or something. So yeah, there's a huge task to be done there. I think I'll just end by saying, look, I think, where we need to keep debating, etc., I think we really need to look at this whole question of negotiation. Because, look, it always sounds nice to stand up and say, sweep the system away, etc. But if that's simply a slogan, then we're not moving forward at all. Oh, and sorry, there is one final point, and then I will get that. Somebody talked about institutional autonomy, which I didn't talk about. I think that's a very interesting issue for us to debate if we're concerned about democracy. Incidentally, I started opposing institutional autonomy not a couple of months ago, but 8 or 10 years ago. I don't think that universities should have institutional autonomy because besides all the other factors, you can use institutional autonomy to ban the free speech of people who say things the university doesn't like. What I would like us to debate and what I would like us to consider is if you say that you don't need university autonomy because universities should be responsible to society, I agree with you 100%. But that doesn't mean that the university must then be responsible to 4 people in a government office, okay? The university we must look at ways of ensuring that the university is accountable to society by democratic structures within the university. I mean, there's a lot to be done with university councils, university senates, and make sure that working people in this country and poor people in this country can have a direct say in what it is that universities do. And that, I think, is a very important demand to support. Thanks.